Thank you for your patience while we mic'd up what I like to call the George Clinton P. Funkadelic panel of RFC authors. It takes a little while with this many speakers. So we're going to start with two housekeeping items. Two of our panelists are literally going to fly off stage and run for a car because they have to make a flight at like 7:50. So just so you know, if they don't stop to answer your questions, it's because they really want to get to their next destination. So apologies. I'll start with the why of why we decided to do this panel. And Twilio sits kind of at the center of a number of communication channels, amongst them email and voice. And so we noticed that a lot of what's happening today around robocalls, for those of us of a certain age that have been in the industry for a long time, it's happened before, specifically with email. We saw legislation, we saw the rise of technical standards to control abuse, and it's happening again. And we are pretty much at the precipice of some major changes within the industry in terms of being able to control this stuff and address it in a sophisticated technical manner. So earlier you heard from Krista and Tim about shake and stir, or I like the James Bond way of saying it, stir shaken, rolls off the tongue a lot better. So stir shaken and what it's going to do for us in the industry. We decided we also want to hear from the people that actually wrote these standards and created them, because it's a sea change within the industry. It is a meaningful shift in how we process phone calls, similar to how we think about email and identity and trust, given the fact that email didn't have any of these things when it was created. It was an open standard, and nobody anticipated billions of people and how they would be connected by email. So we're going to start off with a round of introductions. I'll ask you all to introduce yourselves and maybe mention the RFC that you had a hand in creating, starting with Mary.
Okay, Mary Barnes. I'm with iConnective. RFC 80, I don't remember their passport number.
8588, I think.
8588 for the passport for Shaken is what Chris and I worked on together, and then John, Chris and I worked on Acme protocol stuff. And then also Chris and I worked in the ADIS, the IPN&I group, editing 3 of the major specs there.
Awesome.
I'm John Peterson from Newstar, and I've done a few RFCs over the last 20 years. My name is on the SIP RFC and RFC 3261. I drew the short straw to do security for that, and I've been atoning for it for the remainder of my life. Oh. And it is because we experimented with so many of these identity technologies early on in SIP in the early 2000s that we decided to revisit this, hence the R in STIR, Secure Telephone Identity Revisited. And you will find my name on most of the STIR RFCs.
Murray Kucheravi. My RFCs were all authentication results, Demark, DCAM. I managed to avoid the mushroom cloud at the IETF that was SPF. And I started there, and everything sort of since then I've had some sort of finger in as far as email goes.
Steve Jones. I am not actually an author or editor. I am the imposter on the panel. However, I was in the room on the committees and so forth for things like DCAM, Demark, and so forth. About 10 years in and out of email at Bank of America for the enterprise perspective on the sender as well as the receiver, and a couple of years now as executive director of Demark.org.
Chris Wendt. I'm at Comcast. I am co-author of 8224, 8225 on the IETF side. As Mary mentioned, editor and co-author of the major documents in the ADIS IPN&I task force. I also co-chair of the IPN&I task force. I also co-chair the STIGA Governance Authority Technical Committee, which has just been formed and will be governing for the US, all of the PKI.
And I'm Christopher Fahlgren, architected within Twilio's voice and video business unit. I have no RFC to my name. And I'm part of the team that's actually doing these implementations within Twilio for Stir and Shaken and telephony. So I'm going to help ask questions about the telephony part of this.
And my name's Len Schneider. I'm the VP of Industry Relations for Twilio SendGrid, and I've been doing email for way too long, since before CAN spam.
Oh, wow.
So I thought maybe we could do a little replay of what email was like, when it started. 1971, Ray Tomlinson sent the very first email. I'm partial to the 1976 date where Queen Elizabeth became the first monarch to send an email. But today we're looking at about half a trillion, sorry, that's a T. That's 496 billion emails a day. Most of it is spam. And MOG, the Messaging Malware Mobile Anti-Abuse Working Group, solicited its ISP members to contribute some anonymous data to find out what percentage of the email that they get on a daily basis is horrible. And that was 90%, that was 2014. So we made progress, about 5% of progress. But as you can see, it's kind of a lopsided affair and an avalanche of really bad stuff. So the question really becomes is, how do we deal with really bad stuff and find a clean way of doing it? So I want to go back in time for a moment, and maybe Murray and Steve, you could talk a little bit about how we dealt with really bad stuff before email authentication became a viable data point to be able to filter on it.
Let's see, when I joined SendMail, the things that we were doing were things, Spam Assassin hadn't quite appeared yet. We were doing things like, if you see this string in the subject, then it was probably bad. If it came from this IP address, it was probably bad. And they were manually edited lists. You can imagine how well that scaled. So the next big thing was Spam Assassin, which was a downloaded rules-based. If you see these pattern anywhere in the headers, then that's probably spam. And you started to get in towards scoring and that kind of thing. I guess the next evolution would have been SPF and sender ID, and then right at the end of that is about when I joined the whole thing and started it with DCAM open source and that kind of stuff. So that's the history that I can remember. But yeah, it was all a very manual process to begin with because we had no idea just what that slope looked like.
Yeah.
The game Whack-A-Mole comes to mind.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, I've got all this spam from this particular sender. Okay, we'll block that. Oh wait, that didn't work so well.
They changed 1 to 2. Oh no.
And then the wonderful practice of blocking entire country code top-level domains.
Yeah.
Who wants email from Korea? No, that's all spam. We don't want to receive any of that. Not viable. So it's a good thing that we did get to producing some standards. Unfortunately, you then have to figure out what is going to make people adopt the standards, both on the sending side and the receiving side. So I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more as we go through the questions.
Absolutely. So about 2004, we were dealing with a couple things. So from the sending side of the house, there were kind of two mushroom clouds that happened. One was called the spam button. AOL released it around 2003, 2004, and most marketers thought, okay, that's the end of everything. Most major mailbox providers adopted some form of it thereafter, and we had canned spam. Did either of these things actually move the needle in terms of going into SPF and then further authentication?
Not as far as standards development went. I don't remember there ever being any feedback towards the standards process that was, CanSpam said this, we better change the standards to accommodate it. I don't remember anything like that. That was more operator practices, which standards tends to consider, but is not the main thrust of what we were worried about. So it probably helped, but not in ways that we could see.
I would say that the prevalence of it was received in certain cases, was well received in certain cases. So the enterprise perspective at the bank at the time, they were very happy to see something that promised some kind of relief, some kind of way to say, no, really, this is really from us, it's okay. The problem was that there was not a lot of adoption to support that in the ecosystem as a whole. So when we talked to the postmaster at AOL and said, no, really, if it doesn't pass SPF and it says it's from us, you can block it, he laughed. First off, I can't count on that. You don't really know who's sending as you. Second off, that's a great solution for about 0.1% of everything I'm dealing with in terms of the email volume then around 2006 or 7. So it was promising. And then we also have to look at the fact that, of course, the initial press on any of these technologies, any of these protocols, as soon as they came out, it was, hooray, we're saved. And then about 2 weeks later, you see all the other articles come out that say, oh my God, the bad actors are using this. We're doomed, doomed. It's actually very amusing to go back and see these processes, these cycles repeat themselves with SPF, with DCAM, and so on.
Spammers were one of the first ones to start signing DCAM en masse, more so than legitimate brands, because that was hard.
I would like to think that at this point in the standards process, we are factoring that into our design. Like, they are going to be the first ones to do it, so we shouldn't assume that's not the case.
Well, and to be honest, though, I mean, after the doom and gloom, and after you calm your manager down, this is a good thing. We want things that will help us identify the messages, both good and bad. If they're sending bad things, but we can tell it's from them,
Yeah,
win.
Exactly.
It's what I was getting at is that you can't assume that only good people will do this.
Right.
Don't design anything that way because it's false. So.
Exactly. That's-
So can you walk us through a brief overview of DCAM and how that got merged from two different standards?
So DCAM came from, it was half Yahoo domain keys and half Cisco Internet Identified Mail. And they both were essentially running in the same direction, but neither one wanted to cede ground in the run towards standardization. So as I recall, Eric Allman of SendMail brokered a merger of the two, essentially. And we ended up with the format that is DCAM. I would say that most of it was domain keys, because domain keys was nicer to look at. If you were to grab the header, it was somehow mentally easier to parse, even though it was still just like tag value, tag value, tag value. And that's the way it ran after a while.
Very cool. So what led to the creation of Demark, and why didn't we have policy on top of the original spec?
Well, if I'm not mistaken, there was a policy element in domain keys. But you then enter the, I think it was 3-year-long standardization process where all the voices in the room come into play in terms of, well, I think this is viable, I don't think that's viable, and so forth. In the end, while there was an addition to include some policy, I think if you go through the text, you'll actually see 1 or 2 points where it says, don't use this. Wait, what?
It's very hard to make it work properly.
So, yeah, and there were practical considerations. If you have a ramp for adopting DCAM itself, then you have to adopt the add-on on top of that to give you policy and so forth. So the, and feel free to jump in and correct me. You got into this earlier than I did. But with Demark, what you had was a coalition of the willing. Actually, it was literally the part of the initial project name, which I won't get into because it's had the desired effect already. But you had a small number of companies, went from a dozen to maybe a dozen and a half eventually. But these companies came together and said, okay, there are all kinds of problems with trying to get this adopted en masse across industry and so forth. If we agree to this, if we see a viable solution here and can create a working feedback loop to incentivize both the senders and the receivers to use these technologies to improve the quality of email and so forth, let's go with that. And this is basically what gave rise to what became Demark. As a sender, you are advertising that you're adopting this technology and that you're going to clean up your practices. You're also saying, hey, I want you to send me feedback about this. And in return for my willingness to clean up my practices, the mailbox provider is going to make a large investment in trying to track the results of how these messages all evaluated and then share that with you as the domain owner. This is pretty big stuff, pretty heady stuff at the time. This is the kind of visibility from the, again, enterprise sender perspective. I can't buy this. This is wonderful. But it creates this virtual circle. You've adopted, you've published that you're opting into this practice and so forth. So it becomes very powerful for those that are looking to improve things as a whole. The other side is you get visibility into the abuse against your brand, domain, et cetera, in the reporting that's included as part of Demark. So I know I've kind of wandered around a bit, but basically the idea was, how do we get something that operates at scale? We had already seen great success. I shouldn't say we, the folks at eBay and Yahoo had seen great success in a bilateral agreement using domain keys, and that's really what sparked, I think, the rest of the effort in trying to figure out how to make that work at internet scale.
So that's a really lovely segue. So we're now talking about Demark and its adoption, and there was some data released recently from 250OK and Valimail where showing global Demark adoption is slightly abysmal given the fact that it's a very viable solution to protecting your brand and ensuring that it doesn't get abused, and also harvesting this forensic data back, right? As an evangelist and running Demark.org, what do you think are the biggest barriers to this adoption?
Nobody is going to make you do it. There is no central point of control for email on the internet. I'm surprised we don't hear more laughter. I must be delivering the line wrong.
Maybe silent tears.
Tears of sadness. Yeah, I mean, basically there's no one to say, along with how you name hosts and what kind of DNS records that you publish, you must go out and do these different things with authentication. Part of that goes to the long, long service life of email the SMTP protocol and so forth. A lot of people have been using it in a lot of different ways in the 30, 40, 50 odd years that you can look at something recognizably as that. And they are not all accommodated by the technical standards that we came up with. That was in many cases unavoidable. But they assumed a completely open academic or academic research environment, and that's not the world we live in right now after the commercialization of the internet, if you can remember that from the 90s. So it's something that has to be a thing that the sender and or receiver see an advantage to them in adopting, and nobody's going to make them do it, with the exception maybe of certain government policies. Maybe if you want to deal with the federal government in the US, they'll tell you have to do these things. Certainly now with BOD 18, I think it is, and so forth.
DHS.
You'll see more things like this coming along.
Adoption.
The government in the United Kingdom is actually very active in promoting this. The Dutch government, the same. A lot of activity in Japan. That's my hit list in terms of the top participants and whatnot.
The government is very into it, but industry has had the opposite reaction to it. Part of it is when Yahoo decided to turn Demark on at the reject setting, it broke pretty much every IETF.org mailing list, and all the technologists who use this are now basically consider this technology to be completely broken because it caused all this collateral damage. And I guess there are some solutions meant to patch Demark that are in progress. We'll see how well they do. They're going to come out first as experimental status, and we'll see how they go from there.
Yeah.
There's also the argument made that if you are tasked with generating the reports, you have to keep all this aggregated information and blast it out every so often. Now you have a big infrastructure cost, and so why should I bother? There are operators of Demark services who have noticed that a lot of companies will implement the filtering piece of it and not the rejection piece, but not the reporting piece, and there's no cost to them to not bothering with that half of the specification. So that's why you sort of see this partial thing going on.
That is in fact a huge pain point for the community right now. I don't know if it rises to the level of being the free rider syndrome, but a lot of people are very unhappy about that. It breaks the fundamental compact of, I'm going to work to improve my practices, you're going to work to help me do that by providing some visibility. There are things happening in the background. Let's hope they get somewhere in the near future.
There are tangible benefits to actually, entering to this compact and maintaining it. It's kind of hard to see it, but again, there's that spike on federal side being ad enforcement, essentially.
Yeah.
But to bring it back, that's the difference. With email, it's a free-for-all, so to speak. It's the biggest federated system, but it's the biggest federated system, and there's nobody telling you what the requirements are. Whereas, I think you may find in other venues, other technologies, there's a little more control to be able to impose certain things.
We're actually going to get that, so I'll ask you one more question, and maybe Krister, you want to talk a little bit about the telephony side. What does the future of authentication look like? Are there other technologies in the works? What are we driving toward to actually solve either this disconnect between brands adopting it and the other problems? Are there technologies that are going to address cousin domains?
That's a large one.
Yeah, there were, I think it's safe to say a lot of cycles have been spent thinking about whether there could be some kind of standards-based approach to, for example, cousin domains that look like but are not quite what they claim to be. A lot of vendors have implemented solutions on their own, which is great. I mean, it's a difficult problem that needs a solution, but all of this together means that there isn't a technical standard that I'm aware of that is going to do anything like try to address cousin domains.
Yeah, I think one of the problems too is that cousin domains in the email space and cousin domains in the web space come at it from exactly opposite directions, and nobody wants to come up with two standards. They want to come up with one that encompasses both. That's really hard. Back to your question about where are we going next, my concern is that the standards work is sort of patching on top of more and more layers on top of Demark, solving a bit more of the problem and a bit more of the problem. But that becomes, now every layer of infrastructure has a cost to it. Now the email stack is this high and it's really complicated and hard to understand. And I think that something more fundamental has to happen before we can all finally rest at night and say this is working as we hoped it would. But the industry seems to have a lot of energy for doing these sort of like one-off, okay, we'll fix this corner, we'll fix this, and I don't know where they're getting it. I'm tired.
I'd turn it around. I'd say they're tired enough that all they can muster the energy for
just these
are
little
little
things,
things.
right?
So you
That may
start
be
up with
the case.
SMTP, and then you get SPF, DCAM, Demark, now ARC on top of that, which addresses some of the
And then
shortcomings.
PSD. And then,
Yeah, so, yeah.
So thank you for sharing your 1,000-yard stare. Definitely see the tiredness in your eyes.
very well put, actually.
We'll jump into this next stat as a preface to our next half. If this was This American Life, I would say chapter 2, right? Robocalls. So 9,500 unwanted calls per second is the stat that we've generally seen, and 2.5 billion monthly calls. That's a lot of unwantedness out there in the world. So Chris, can you take a stab at kind of like defining the scope of this problem? And other than these numbers, like how bad is it?
Well, I think everybody knows how bad it is just from personal experience, but you know, like from a company that runs a telephone network, you know, it literally is pretty much half of calls that we see come into our network are, you know, spam calls. They have, you know, illegitimate or they're unassigned numbers, or, you know, like all the techniques that robocallers use to just like incrementally dial everybody and all those things. Like we see all that traffic. So it's, you know, a huge problem to the consumer, obviously, which is the thing we're trying to solve, but you know, it's clogging the network as well unnecessarily. So you know, it's huge.
Yeah. So one key aspect of all of these robocalls is that many of them have spoofed numbers, calling numbers, impersonating someone. How come we came to this situation? John, do you have a...
Well, I mean, you know, in typical IETF best practice, we copied the from header field from email and put it into SIP. And because of that, really pretty much anyone with a SIP user agent could populate the from header field how they felt like. And, you know, I mean, early on back in the late 90s when we were big dreamers thinking big about what would happen with voice over IP and real-time communications on the internet, you know, we imagined we would move away from telephone numbers and that we would end up with using email-style identifiers. And so we really looked at this problem initially like it was very similar to the problem of DCAM. And in fact, if you look back historically, like the work we were doing early on for this, it was connected with IAM. Like the people who were doing IAM, like Mike Thomas, he was a guy that I was talking to all the time as we were doing the first steps towards SIP identity. The problem was, you know, we took a stab at this, and it was not a good stab. It was not an accurate stab initially for how to do this identity. And the biggest deficiency of it probably was it didn't really account for telephone numbers. Telephone numbers just change everything about how this works. If you can't rely on the DNS, you can't put, you know,
Right.
TXT records or something in the DNS that are going to, you know, provide useful information about this, you have a very different problem set. And this is how we ultimately ended up diverging, I think, from it. But yeah, the root cause was, you know, the typical just let's copy something that we see working, and that's from header fields.
Because email's working.
Email was working. Email was working better than SIP. I mean, SIP
fair
was a
enough.
toy then, and email was a worldwide technology. And this is another factor it's probably worth raising about this, right, is that we didn't really start to feel the pain until SIP became real. It wasn't worth sending spam with SIP until, I don't know, 2008, 2010, right, is when this started to become an endemic problem because so much of the SIP network had interconnected then with the PSTN. And the people who designed the gateways, these jokers, and I am one of these jokers, you know, they had no policy for determining whether or not you should communicate this obviously fraudulent from header field to this closed telephone network that people rely on that's very secure and all of that. And so these are the things that led us into the hole that we're now trying to dig ourselves out of.
I think it's important there is legitimate cases for spoofing numbers, and that's the original use case, but people took advantage of that, obviously.
Of course, yeah.
So talking about those legitimate use cases, Mary, can you explain what would be normal use cases where you can do this?
Well, one example is Skype, right? I have my Skype account configured so that my cell phone number goes across. Because if people remember in the early days of Skype, you got some really funny numbers and people wouldn't answer your call, right? 011, et cetera. So, I mean, that's legitimate, right? Another example is doctors, right? In most cases, if your doctor's doing a follow-up call, they're not giving you their number so you can call them at home at, 1 a.m. So, it's legitimate spoofed number. I'm trying to think of another example. You used it in yours, actually, I think.
The school district call.
The school district calls, exactly. Well, that's the mass calling that's legitimate. So, I mean, there are a number, and this is the concern, right? We want to make sure these calls still go through and don't get tagged.
Does SIP have the notion of X on behalf of Y? Because email sort of has that, but it's not well used.
We don't quite
Not quite?
have
Just curious.
that. We don't want to add that. Yeah, I don't want to think about that. Yeah.
Just curious.
Inherit one more problem. But I mean, it is a legitimate concern. Well, another example, that's what it was, is emergency callback. So if you call 911 and they want to call you back because they don't have all the right information, you're not getting it doesn't display that this is an incoming 911 call. It looks like a regular phone number. And so you would hope that the person, right, that made the 911 call, they need to pick up, right? But nowadays we're all conditioned, we don't pick up from unknown numbers, right? And it's the same thing. The cop comes to the place and they're calling you from an unknown number, right? So there are some, literally it can be life and death in some cases if the call doesn't go through and people don't pick up, right? So yeah.
So this is actually for John. You mentioned that SIP was based on an email header. How much of Stir Shaken was based or influenced or spiritually guided at all by DCAM Demark?
Like I'd say, I think they were connected in their development. Mike Thomas and I were constantly engaged in a very fruitful and candid conversation about the proper approaches to this. And again, if it hadn't been for the fact that we needed to deal with these telephone numbers, we could have ended up with something that looks very similar to DCAM. So that reuse might have been possible. And it's not like this was not raised at various stages in the development of Stir Shaken. Why aren't you doing something that's more like DCAM? Why aren't you using the DNS as an infrastructure to store keys? And of course, DNSSEC and some of the things like that are obviously caveats that made us a bit concerned about it. But honestly, that door is still open today. I could still imagine doing credentialing in some environments using the DNS, provided, again, we could lick the problems of how you handle telephone numbers in the DNS. And this is something that people in the telecommunications industry it's a hill that people have been dying on for like 20 years. There's this thing called enum, which is this attempt to try to integrate telephone numbers through reverse resolution and turn them into domain names. And unfortunately, it has not been a resounding success in its implementation as a national numbering plan.
Right, well, because the problem is we already have deployed databases, everything's working, right? And people do not want to forklift that stuff out and put something new in. It just, the resistance is incredible, actually, yeah.
Awesome.
So if you follow news, you see that a lot of politicians and a lot of government activity in terms of pressuring the industry to adopt or to mitigate this problem. How do you think that has affected the development of this? And can you put some colors to that, Chris?
Yeah, sure. I mean, obviously, it has helped push the industry forward, and overall, it's been a good thing. In 2016, the FCC held a robocall strike force that was essentially an exercise in like a call to the industry, like how do we solve this problem? It was a forum where carriers, vendors, all had to come forward and essentially in the way that the FCC does public statements, say like we are committed to solving this problem. And I had participated in this effort, and we certainly made a lot of progress. It was about the time that Stir and Shaken was born, where the protocols from IETF and the industry forum and in the IPNNI came forward, and we came together, and the rest is sort of history. But that was the initial point, and there's been follow-up, and people now know that we need to solve this, and it really has been a great industry collaboration. A little push behind it, but I think everybody knows that to say that we don't want to solve this problem is probably not a very popular statement.
Well, and the interesting thing, I think this is the first time where we had the people that are actually going to deploy the protocols in the room with us, right? Because in IETF, we've designed a lot of stuff that's really cool, right? But the people that really might use it are not in the room often, right? And so that was, I think, the first time we had that much energy from both sides. So that was great, yeah.
Well, was stir shaking a thing before the FCC and everyone started getting involved, or?
John was, you
So
were
Stir was,
toying
it
with
actually
it, yeah.
started with the
Yeah.
FCC. The FCC came to us, to the IETF actually. So
Yeah.
Henning Schultz-Renee, who was the CTO of the FCC then, came to the IETF and asked, would you mind taking another crack this identity thing? Because we have all this robocalling stuff is getting really bad. And we did. We scoped a new problem statement, a new threat model, and so on. So I mean, I think that was one of the instigating forces. But yes, as Chris said, it was really the point when the operational community and the people thinking about this at ADIS and the IETF entered into this joint work that we've been doing in lockstep ever since, that this opportunity rose to really, I think, make significant headway on this. And I think right now it looks extremely promising that we might put a dent in this.
Yeah.
So the FCC has put a lot of pressure on the industry, making statements like, "Oh, it must be done in 2019, or else we'll do something about it." Has that led to any rushed decisions or anything that's necessarily sort of?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I think we've been fairly purposeful in the process and making decisions and making the right decision. I mean, yeah.
I mean,
Some runway. It's been like 6 years since
Yeah.
the STIR effort started, right? And we've been slow rolling it in particular to make sure that we're getting requirements from the carriers, from the operational community, and without that, yeah, I don't think we'd be in as good position as we are now to have something mature enough to ship this year.
Right. Well, yeah, because
Yeah,
you guys have been prototyping all along, and there's code out there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the good thing is that it's been a balanced, there's been push, but it's also been, like changing the way that we fundamentally do calls and adding this whole PKI infrastructure, that's a pretty big deal. It's like steering a big ship. So I think on both sides, it's been realistic expectations of like, we got this, we have specs that we think are the right thing. We want to put authenticated identity into the telephone network. And so like, I think we're all pretty confident. Things are gonna obviously change probably as things go along, but I think we think we have the right fundamental technology that we're putting in the network as a basis for whatever tools we want to build going forward that can improve.
Yeah. Well, and I think we have it well scoped for our first step, right? Yeah. We didn't want to, solve world hunger, right?
Yes.
And I guess you've got a question there on that. Am I leading to your silver bullet question? Yeah.
Right. So looking at Demark, what was the adoption number? 10% or something?
Yeah, 6% at enforcement.
What do you guys foresee as the adoption? How quickly will the industry adopt stir shaking?
Well, the
Mary?
FCC has pretty much said you guys got to do it. So I think it's going to happen this year, I believe. So,
I think all the major carriers and major landline providers have committed to have stir shaken in the network by the end of 2019. Covering most calls. There is some call cases that we still have yet to have the full solution for, but at least the calls that we care about the most, calls to cell phones and landlines, will definitely be signed in most service provider networks. So, the percentage of calls, I don't have an exact figure, but it's a major percentage. Like, that's at least 50% of the calls. Hopefully by the end of this year or by beginning of 2020 will be covered. So.
Yeah. Well, and what I was going to say, one of the things we have that is an advantage from what email had was the policy administrator, right? We have a central policy administrator that decides who gets to be part of this ecosystem. So the CAs need to be approved, the service provider all have to be identified so we can trace back, and we're using identifiers that service providers already have in the network, well-known identifiers, OCNs, and that sort of thing. So we're a step ahead, you know, in terms
This is a government-controlled thing?
Well, no, there is, so the governance authority is part of ADIS. So the FCC,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
This is one thing
It's
that
actually industry-led,
Right,
to be
right.
correct. It's obviously, we're reporting what's happening to the FCC, but it is an industry-led organization.
one of the things that email has always lacked is some kind of central authority, and that has been the case because we're allergic to the idea of some central thing being controlled.
Right,
So it
but
would be like ICANN, right?
Right.
Forcing
Cool.
registry
Exactly, right,
To
right,
like say
right,
anybody who doesn't
right,
have, you know, email is going to do
yeah,
this.
yeah.
Right.
And
So in one sense, it's easier for us because we already have the telephone number,
Yeah.
and that network is already controlled
Yeah.
by, effectively, you have to go to NECA to get your OCN.
Yeah, I think it's important to point out, like, you know, we have the North American numbering plan. It is, you know, managed by the FCC. You know, so there is inherently like owning or using a telephone number is a privilege that's granted by the Federal Communications Commission. So, which is not what happens in the email network, obviously. So. So we sort of have that inherent advantage that there is already policy and regulatory backing of how telephone numbers work on the telephone network.
I remember in 2007-ish, the companies that were talking about this were invited to Washington to the Federal Trade Commission, and they got up and they said, what laws can we write for you that will help this happen? What policies can we set? And we never took advantage of it specifically because we don't like the idea of any sort of central authority.
Right.
Maybe we should have. Maybe that was an oversight on our part.
Very
Maybe
idealistic approach.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
I have pictures from there where the commissioner that was assigned to the thing was falling asleep while we were talking about all of our stuff. And really a very interesting conversation.
We have lots of energy from the government on this one, yeah.
So I'm curious, how much noise will this take out of the system? Krister has this great quote where McCracken, I believe?
Sorry, Jim McCaker?
McCacken, that's right.
Oh, McCacken, oh, yeah.
Apparently there's 3 ways to pronounce his name. But nonetheless,
I'm the authority because I worked for him at Nortel. So.
there you go. Nonetheless, he says, okay, so Stir Shaken's actually going to make robocalls more like spam. It'll be just manageable. It'll be background noise, and you know, my mom gets a bunch of spam, but most of it winds up in the appropriate place, right? The rest of it's stuff that she intentionally wants, which boggles my mind. So is that going to be the case with Stir Shaken? Like, will it be a manageable amount of noise? Or is it going to be like, oh, we're never going to hear our phones ring again unless it's a loved one calling?
I mean, I think to start with that, yes, it's very important to understand it's not a silver bullet, right? This is a foundational technology. The problem is so many of the analytics we could apply that will differentiate good from bad calls are dependent on the calling party number not being impersonated, right? Like if the calling party number can be impersonated, then so many of the tools we'd use to be able to sort good from bad are gonna be shaky. And so, yeah, we should look at it like, you know, it is a necessary condition, I think, for getting to a stable state where this is an addressable problem, but it's not a sufficient condition. That this is something that is just laying the framework, the groundwork really for where we go from here.
So looking at this problem, do you think it will evolve to become much like email in that you have your spam folder for voice calls, or what do you think? John?
I mean, I guess I can imagine using your voice jail, as people call it these days, as a place to send calls for special treatment that you don't want to receive. Yeah, I mean, I think there's going to be a variety of display outcomes. There's going to be some calls that it'll be easy to block. Chris mentioned there are a lot of robocalls these days to actually use like unallocated numbers, right? That it's obviously not coming from a legitimate consumer, and these kinds of things should just be nipped in the bud so that they're never presented to the user. The challenge of figuring out how to train users to understand the information that StirShaken can provide, and that the analytics derived from StirShaken, building on top of it, can inform you about whether or not you want to accept communications. That's going to be a challenge. It is, and there's going to be a variety of stakeholders in that who are very different from the stakeholders we've discussed so far. This is a lot of handset vendors and application vendors and things like that. And so there's going to be, I think, an additional process once StirShaken becomes widespread to kind of vet what the right way is to let consumers know what they should make of these calls.
We face the same problem. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, well, I was going to say, Chris, highlight the safe harbor thing, right? That the FCC now allows a service provider to block a call, right? And that's an important aspect of dealing with this, I think.
We face the same problem you were describing in an email, where I might present to you, this message was actually legitimate. The DCAM passed for spammer.org, and you have to know that spammer.org is a bad thing in order to do something with it. So they've taken advantage of the thing. And so teaching users to interpret the additional information we're giving them is a whole new problem that we don't know how to solve in email.
Yeah.
So call analytics, I talked about that in our session earlier today. As a service provider, Chris, how do you see this evolving for the consumers?
Well, I think, like we talked about, like putting trust back into the telephone network. Analytics is going to be part, like I was actually going to mention, there's lots of different classifications of calls that you may want to block. There's the pure illegitimate things that people are trying to scam people. There's like the unwanted calls that, like you don't necessarily want to get those calls. Analytics is just going to be a part of trying to identify those things. Classifying calls is going to help as well. That's a potential tool that we have. And then, just providing, the main point is, we want to provide, as a telephone service provider, consumers the choice to decide, what calls they want to receive, what calls they don't want to. Is it part of, they just want to receive calls from their family and friends? So we're trying to give the consumer more dials and knobs to control their telephone experience.
Awesome. What about text messages? Isn't that telephony too?
Yeah, well,
So I think so. And again, a lot of what Stir consists of, right? When we look at StirShaken overall, is this credentialing system, right? Is giving people certificates that let them attest authority for telephone numbering resources. And it would seem like a real waste to me if we did not take this massive infrastructure we're building. Again, the FCC is involved, there's GAs, there's PAs, there's CAs, and actually leverage that to be able to provide comparable security for text. This has never been so tightly coupled, I think, to SIP, that component of it hasn't, and to establishing real-time communications. If we can't get to a place where we're using that for text messages, I think we've really dropped the ball.
I mean, technically, I think that's a great idea. But if you look at what we did with standards and text messaging and stuff, we had a very difficult time converging, right?
But again, I don't think the protocol convergence is what's essential.
Well, I know, I understand
credentials.
that, but getting people to agree to use the same credentials, right?
We'll get there, I'm sure.
Okay.
So I'm going to just kind of ask one little wrap-up question here. And then maybe we could take a couple questions before you guys have to make like the wind and vanish. So you guys have been essentially tackling abuse on a really, really massive scale, at a kind of foundational scale, which is like we want to create things that address abuse in a holistic, meaningful, and long-term way, as opposed to playing whack-a-mole. Right. What kind of lessons could our audience of developers take away in dealing abuse and being part of a trust ecosystem, which is, this is really what it's all about, is being one of the good actors, right?
I like to say, and I think it sort of corresponds, if I can tie it back to what Jeff said this morning, like engaging your customers is all about, being good to your customer in terms of calling them and practice instead of trying to scam them, become part of the conversation with them. And I think that's going to be the, a lot of the industry has developed themselves to be try to get around and use the spoofing things to do these things. I think once we put trust in the network, once we expose who is doing these things, the only path forward is to just have a trust relationship with your customer, at least on from an enterprise point of view. So I think that's the path forward. That's like the good story, the good outcome that we're looking for. That like people start trusting, they start picking up their calls, they know who's calling them, and people like using the telephone again.
Right.
And I might add to that, just don't be afraid to be incremental. Don't boil the ocean. Pick something that's achievable. Get people to buy in across operators, across developers, across service bureaus, and so on just the most foundational and simple components of it, and then build on top of that. Because dealing with something that is this entrenched, this big, you kind of have to take it slow.
Right.
You got to take it in steps, get everybody on board, consensus, and this is everything. Because if you don't get everybody on board with this, you're in a real world of hurt.
Right.
What are the first logical steps that some of these up-and-coming companies can take, without boiling the ocean, without looking at this problem?
Sure.
It's totally insurmountable.
And I would look to the history of DCAM and things like that for this. I think having the big providers signing and sending their calls out signed provides a tremendous incentive for the smaller providers to start doing verification, to make sure that these aren't scam calls coming in. And so it might be easier to be a verifier originally, right? And just to make sure your customers aren't being scammed than it is to actually do the signing component yourself.
Exactly.
But I think it is getting these big carriers, and God bless Chris and the other people that have really gone to bat for this, that are large carriers in America. Their adoption of this will be so crucial to making sure that this trickles all the way down to consumers.
Right. Yeah.
And outside of America?
I would love to see this go. I think everybody wants to see how well we do,
Yeah,
right?
they're
Because
waiting.
nobody,
They're
who
sitting-
knows if
yeah.
these, we could be jokers, right? We're here like saying all this
Yeah.
fancy stuff to you, but like very few robocalls have probably been stopped by Stir Shaken yet. And that's fair, right? I mean, so I know there's some live operational signing now, but let's be candid, right? People want to see how well this does, and this is not the first time that United States carriers and operators will have taken the initial step, and other people kind of wait and see how we do. They're coming around.
Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing that I've learned is, it is sort of a U.S.-centric problem. I mean, it's not that there isn't robocalling and illegitimate spam, and I think Canada and UK have been probably the ones that, and India also has been talking about it. But we just had a session at the last IETF with a lot of the other, a bunch of other smaller countries, and they haven't seen it yet. But I think they're convinced that they need to start looking at it. And,
Right.
if it starts being solved in certain parts of the world, will it move to other parts?
Exactly.
And they want to be ready for
the whack-a-mole.
it. So.
Right. We fix it in the U.S. and they're going to go after the people in the other countries, right? Yeah.
So if we do fix it in the U.S., do you foresee potentially that problem becoming more prevalent in other countries? Because all of a sudden, we have a solution.
We think it's a possibility,
and those are
yes.
the new markets for bad actors.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. We
Potential for
raise
that.
the bar and we make it too expensive for them to do what they want to do. And the first time you put somebody in jail for this stuff, tell you what, those people, rats off a ship. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's hope it works exactly as intended. We have a few minutes. I want to be sensitive of Mary and Chris's time. So are there any questions for these folks that have essentially written our future? If you would come up to the mic, we are recording. That would be fantastic. Thank you, sir.
So you guys kind of got this question prior, but I'm not sure I got a super clear answer to it. I work for Home Depot, by the way, and so we're actively trying to make sure that our calls, specifically calls about orders where we're doing business with our customer already, are not going to get blocked, and the people are going to ultimately answer them. Thinking about kind of the first calendar day of 2020, what do we think this is really going to look like? Like, is it going to be a dramatic change, or is behavior going to shift and take advantage of the loopholes that still exist out there?
Yeah. I mean, I definitely think they're going to take advantage of the loopholes that are out there, you know. And one theory I have is they're going to come in through the SS7 network versus the IP network.
Right. I mean, you're going to see people, doing whatever they can to get calls through to keep the business models that they have. I think that the optimistic view is that, as more calls are signed, as the pressure grows those calls will get squeezed into, the smaller parts of the industry, and hopefully, at some point they can be squeezed out as more and more get to be legitimate. It's not going to happen overnight. I think we all recognize that. We're not going to start blocking tons of calls other than things that are like obviously illegitimate or using invalid numbers or things like that. But that will slowly, turn the cranks over time. You'll see that from regulatory side. You'll see that from pressure from consumers probably if the problem keeps going. But yeah, this is an evolving problem. The industry is committed to tackling it. We're working on making sure that the right calls get delivered and the wrong calls don't get delivered, and trying to evolve our toolkit to accommodate those things over time and when they're necessary.
Well, and we got backup too, right? In the sense that you'll be seeing a lot of complementary things that are going on in the industry as well. I mean, if iOS is going to send to voice jail every call that isn't coming from another is in your contact book, that too, as we see all these things, kind of coalescing together, I think we are going to see a pretty significant disruption to robocalling over the next 2 years as a result of just a whole panoply of these efforts.
But not like a 50% drop day one of next year. It'll be.
I can't imagine there will be a 50% drop on day one. No.
Okay. Thanks, guys.
Yeah.
6 months is pretty aggressive for it.
Well, and to me, one of the key things about Shaken is we get a lot more information traceability, right? And so once these guys figure out that we can find them much more quickly, right?
That's a process, right?
It's a process, yeah.
Traceback is then you get the FTC to go after these people, right?
It can happen much more quickly. It takes a lot longer, We'll have more information earlier, right? So.
Yes.
So I've encountered an example recently where there's a draft RFC out for a particular email authentication header. The exact one isn't particularly important.
Can't imagine which one you're talking about.
And we found one significant large provider which is implemented in one certain way, and another which is implemented it in a contradictory way, where if we follow one provider's behavior, we'll give incorrect results for the other and vice versa. As sort of a smaller company providing a small mail provider or a small mail client service, what can we do to help resolve that kind of situation?
Is this a document that's already published, or it's a current draft?
It's currently a draft.
And I would say so on the mailing list and say our experience, as a chair of that working group, I would say I want your feedback so that I can make sure that I want to make sure that whatever this working group produces leaves things better than when it started. I don't want to cause damage. I don't want to release something that's ambiguous so that two different people can come up with completely different non-interoperating solutions and create a big mess. So please send your feedback to the list. Tell us, we've observed this and this. Both of them could be understood from the same document, therefore the text is weak, please fix this. I would love to hear that.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello all. Thank you for the interesting conversation. I wanted to ask, is Stir Shaken, I know it's making sure that the call is incoming from an authorized partner that is allowed and authorized to use the number. Is the next step to include information about the identity of the caller? I mean, have you thought about including information and expanding like the caller name, maybe a business name, and so on?
Yes.
John's RCD.
So yeah, I mean, so there are already, this is still in draft, But yes, Chris and I have been working for some time on adding a rich call data element to the passport, which is conveyed by StirShaken, and that draws on, again, we're thieves, so we just like borrow from J-card, which is V-card, right, as an example of like how you could convey richer contact data, and we'll just cite that in the passport and be done. I'm sure it won't cause any problems, just like copying the from header field from email didn't cause any problems.
Works
So
great.
the hard edges around this, of course, are figuring out how you vet the information that is in that. And we have some stories about this, including ways we can actually bake into the certificates constraints on what will end up being rendered in the passport. And so I think we'll see a whole kind of governance push around this. But to be clear, work in progress, movie coming soon.
Thank you.
Maybe next signal we'll be talking about.
Next signal, next signal, we'll have it on the screen behind us.
Yeah.
Hey, everyone. Thanks for holding the panel here. I work large-scale enterprise voice. I've got 2 questions for you. 2 of the valid use cases we've had, you talked about a lot of the valid cases to spoof caller ID that are legitimate. And 2 of the ones that I've been working with for almost 20 years, even back to the TDM days, were desk phone call forwarding, where you have an employee that wants to be able to see the true Annie of the person calling, and also split carriers. If I've got multiple disparate carriers, I want to be able to send the actual CPN that I physically own out either path. When we see implementation later this year, will those types of edge cases be flagged as spam or denied in any way that you know of?
Yeah.
Good
You want to do this
question.
one, Chris? This one.
So there is a ton of discussion right now on techniques. This is a very hard problem because there's been so much flexibility on some of these things to cover all the use cases.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
I think there is some pretty good proposals. One I'm very much in favor of is delegate certificates, so the ability to sign calls that is delegated from the provider to an enterprise to, as long as they validly have purchased those numbers to use, they can then do whatever they want to, as long as it's legitimate, and sign the calls, and then apply the right calling name and things like that. There's other proposals on the table, like enterprise ID, that allow those things, lemon twist. But yes, we are very actively talking about those use cases. There's also diversion cases, like I think maybe one of yours
The
sort
call
of
forwarding.
implied that, like
Right.
call forwarding scenarios where you go from one number to another number, and you can sign at both points in the network, and make sure that the chain of trust transfers from one number to the next number to the endpoint. So a couple of solutions there that are available.
Right.
Sure.
So, and the meeting we're rushing to is actually to talk about this for the next 2 days.
Yes.
Literally.
Ironic. Does it, will Shake and Stir pass, is it limited to IP-based transit only, or will it be able to traverse SS7?
So we've done some work on this as well, and this again, there's been some initial kicking the tires sorts of experiments around what we call out-of-band stir. We're well aware that unfortunately not every call goes end-to-end SIP today.
Yep.
And so you can look this up. There's a variety of use cases we've explored where you can have something that will actually kind of help store and forward passports if they're going through SS7 instead of over SIP. And there's various security challenges and opportunities that arise from that. But yeah, this is something we've done a tremendous amount of work on because you can't neglect the sheer amount of SS7 that is still out there.
Correct, and that was actually my second question. For international calls from international carriers coming into the U.S., will those be flagged as spam, or do we just allow them to pass straight through? So obviously, if it's an international Annie that's spoofed within the U.S., we can tell, and we can also tell at the carrier level, the OCN of the originating carrier if it's outside the U.S. But I didn't know what had been done in terms of, say, if Telstra or Singtel calls into a Twilio DID that I have, whether that gets flagged as spam or not by Shake and Stir.
So again, so Shake and Stir does not flag things as spam, right? Shake and Stir provides this very foundational, simple assurance that, you know, the entity that has that OCN, right, attests that this calling party number is authentic, and that presumably that they have some relationship or ownership of it. And so it's the analytics, it's all of these things that build on top of that that will decide whether or not to flag it as spam. And in some of these corner cases like you're describing, like international gateways and things like that, that'll be tough. Like there will be policies based on analytics that I'm sure will not be super generous at first. But I think the more we see international deployment of this and the more experience we get, I think the more willing people will be to give positive high-level attestations to those.
Understood. Thank you.
So, thank you very much. Those were great questions. That's all the time that we have. I want you to be able to get out of here on time and make your flight. Can we get a round of applause for these folks? Thank you all very much. Thank you, Murray, for making it on time.